The morning fog clung to the treetops like a wet shroud as the 761st Tank Battalion, the U.S. Army's first all-black armored unit, rolled silently toward the Siegfried Line in November 1944. Known as the Dragon's Teeth, this German defense was more than just a line of concrete obstacles. It was a sprawling, lethal maze of anti-tank traps, minefields, pillboxes, overlapping MG-42 nests, and camouflaged artillery bunkers. Most commanders avoided it when they could. But General George S. Patton, bold, unpredictable, and calculating, had chosen this moment and this unit to crack it wide open. His decision stunned both allies and enemies alike. The soldiers of the 761st, nicknamed the Black Panthers, were not there as an experiment. They were there to fight, and to prove they could tear through the enemy's strongest line of defense. The men of the 761st were fighting on two fronts. One was the visible enemy, the well-entrenched Wehrmacht forces, fortified behind decades of concrete, barbed wire, and ideology. The other was less visible, but equally cruel. Systemic racism from within their own country and command structure. Many of them had trained for years in segregated bases, often with outdated equipment and under constant scrutiny. Some officers didn't believe they were combat ready. Others openly stated that black men couldn't handle tanks. But the 761st had something those critics didn't: unity, pride, and the fire of 1,000 injustices. By the time they reached the edge of the Siegfried Line, they had already endured more from their own government than they expected to face from the Germans. Now they were ready to earn respect the only way that counted: in battle. Their vehicles were M4 A3EH Sherman tanks, nicknamed Easy 8s, equipped with upgraded suspension and high-velocity 76mm guns. Still, they were no match on paper for the deadly German Panthers or the infamous 88mm anti-tank guns that awaited them. But the Black Panthers didn't rely on specs. They relied on speed, cohesion, and aggression. Each crew operated like a single nervous system. They anticipated ambushes, they coordinated reloads without speaking, and they were willing to do what others hesitated to even attempt. In the early hours of November 16th, they advanced toward the German village of Morville-les-Vicq. The air reeked of diesel and frostbitten pine. The roads were barely wide enough for a single tank column, and every bend could hide a mine or a gunner. But there was no pause. The order was clear: move forward, break the line, take the fight to the Reich. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, one of the battalion's most fearless tank commanders, was already nursing a wounded leg from a prior engagement. He should have been pulled from the front, but he refused evacuation, choosing instead to tape up the injury and lead his tank forward. That decision would become legendary. Within minutes of entering the approach route, one of the Shermans triggered a mine and was immobilized. Under sniper fire and with artillery shells bracketing the road, Rivers leapt from his tank, dragged the driver out of the burning wreck, and coordinated the retrieval of the rest of the crew. His commanders begged him to fall back and get treatment. Rivers ignored them. He knew this assault would not survive hesitation, so he climbed back into his Sherman, took command of the column, and resumed the charge with one hand on his leg and the other on the turret traverse. The first German positions opened fire as the battalion cleared the forest edge. MG-42s from bunkers raked the flanks. Mortars rained in from the hills. One of the tanks was hit and began to smoke, but the Panthers kept moving. Rivers led a flanking maneuver that broke open the German machine gun nest, blasting the position with high explosive shells before dismounting infantry cleaned out what was left. Smoke filled the air. Screams echoed in the trees. The defenders had expected a soft probe, not a vengeful armored spearhead. The line faltered. Within 2 hours, the Black Panthers had breached the outer defenses of the Siegfried Line. Enemy radio intercepts recorded frantic chatter. Schwarze Panzertruppen were storming positions long considered impenetrable. German officers were stunned. Who were these men? Where had they come from? The answer? They were Americans, and they were just getting started. By sunset, the 761st had advanced over a kilometer into enemy-held ground. 7 pillboxes had been cleared. 3 enemy tanks were burning. Rivers' tank was still leading the column, despite the growing blood loss in his bandaged leg. His heroism that day wouldn't just make headlines. It would earn him a posthumous Silver Star, though many argued he deserved the Medal of Honor. But more than awards, what he and his unit earned that day was a place in the history books. For the first time, a fully African-American tank unit had breached Germany's most fortified barrier, not as a token gesture, but as the tip of the spear. Patton knew what he had when he gave them the mission, and Germany learned it the hard way, one shattered bunker at a time.
In military circles, George S. Patton was a paradox, a tactical genius wrapped in contradictions. He was a man who openly supported segregation, yet entrusted the 761st with one of the war's most critical assignments. Some believe he chose them to prove a political point, to silence doubters by letting the Black Panthers either fail spectacularly or succeed brilliantly. Others argue he recognized raw talent, unshakable morale, and ruthless efficiency when he saw it. Regardless of his motives, what's clear is this: Patton gave them the hardest job in the most fortified area, under the harshest weather conditions. And what shocked his staff was not just that he deployed them, but that he did so without sending a backup. The 761st would either smash the Siegfried Line or be buried beneath it. The German High Command did not expect serious resistance from black soldiers. Nazi ideology labeled them Untermenschen, subhuman. Their propaganda painted them as inferior, untrained, incapable of organized combat. This psychological underestimation became Germany's greatest tactical mistake. As the 761st surged through bunkers and minefields, intercepted radio chatter captured German voices describing fast, precise, and unrelenting American armor, unlike anything they'd expected. The shock wasn't just racial, it was strategic. They had built the Siegfried Line expecting methodical Allied assaults, not a fury-driven tank battalion that moved like a blade through cloth. The old assumptions about race, about tactics, about who could fight were breaking apart as quickly as the concrete fortifications themselves. Inside the tanks, the crews operated in a state of heightened focus. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Heater systems failed. Tank interiors were metal coffins with roaring engines and deafening shell blasts. Yet even as frost formed on the bolts, loader hands bled from overuse, and ammunition began to run low, the men pressed on. They rotated shifts in rhythm, communicated through gestures, and relied on instinct more than words. These were not just tankers, they were brothers in arms forged through rejection, bonded by fire. Each enemy pillbox they cleared wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a personal reckoning. With every shot, they were rewriting the narrative that had cast them aside. Among them, Technician 5th grade Harold L. Hodge became a symbol of calculated aggression. Tasked with engineering support, he modified fuses in HE rounds to optimize bunker penetration. When his tank's main gun jammed during a firefight, Hodge climbed out under sniper fire and manually dislodged the shell. He reloaded, remounted, and fired again, all within 45 seconds. Actions like these spread through the unit like electricity. Soldiers began to believe not only in the mission, but in themselves. What had once been seen as the Black Battalion was now simply the spearhead. No longer segregated in purpose, their identity was forged not in color, but in action. By November 17th, the battalion had broken through a 5-mile stretch of the Siegfried Line. The impact was immediate. Wehrmacht units began repositioning, fearing a full-scale armored push. German command shifted anti-tank units from other fronts, weakening their eastern and southern flanks. Patton seized the moment. Reinforcements from the 26th Infantry Division poured through the breach the 761st had carved open. Journalists embedded with the Third Army struggled to get permission to cover the unit. Official photos were few. Command feared the political implications. But the men didn't need headlines. Every mile gained, every German bunker shattered, was its own press release. Meanwhile, on the American home front, word of the battalion's breakthrough barely made a ripple. Newspapers carried small blurbs, often without photos, names, or details. The larger narrative remained focused on white divisions crossing the Rhine or liberating towns. But inside the military command structure, the 761st's reputation was exploding. Officers requested transfers into the unit. Armor specialists demanded to study their engagement logs. The Black Panthers had become Patton's scalpel, fast, sharp, and terrifyingly precise. Germany had built its wall with arrogance. The 761st broke it with fury, steel, and silence.
The Siegfried Line wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a symbol of Nazi invincibility. Stretching over 390 miles, it was laced with tank traps, mines, and kill zones designed to bleed Allied forces dry. The most infamous feature, the Dragon's Teeth, were pyramid-shaped concrete blocks meant to immobilize tanks and funnel them into pre-sighted artillery zones. To the Germans, these defenses were supposed to delay or prevent an Allied advance until the last breath. But to the 761st, they were just obstacles to be neutralized. Engineers moved ahead of the tanks at night, feeling for wires with bare hands, praying each touch wouldn't be their last. These moments weren't in the headlines, but they were what made headlines. By the time the battalion reached the town of Tillet, the terrain itself had become an enemy. Mud swallowed entire vehicles, ice covered hatches. Trees stripped of leaves by artillery stood like skeletons watching the carnage. Yet through it all, the men adapted. They wrapped gun barrels in cloth to prevent ice buildup. They insulated fuel lines with stolen Wehrmacht blankets. They cannibalized damaged Shermans to keep others running. Improvisation was the fuel of survival. Every adjustment made in the freezing dark meant one more tank rolling, one more objective reached. And while German tanks like the Panther or Tiger had technical superiority, they didn't have this level of desperation-backed ingenuity. In close-quarter fights, the 761st became shock troops. In the town of Morville-les-Vicq, they coordinated with infantry to execute street-by-street cleansing. One tank would serve as a movable wall, shielding GIs as they crossed alleys. Another would fire point-blank into suspected sniper nests. The coordination was wordless, instinctual. Some buildings were taken without a shot, others cost men dearly. But it was here that the battalion proved they weren't just tankers, they were urban warriors. The sound of tank treads over cobblestone became a warning bell to German defenders. Resistance would be brief and likely fatal. These weren't the lumbering, clumsy tanks of propaganda films. They were hunters. The men knew they were making history, even if history wouldn't record them properly. Sergeant Frank D. Jefferson kept a small notebook under his jacket, hidden from moisture. In it, he sketched maps, enemy positions, even phrases overheard from German prisoners. But mostly, he wrote names of fallen friends, of places where they died, of promises made under fire. If no one remembers us, then we fought for ghosts. That line would not be published until 1991. His book was found in a box of war artifacts, mislabeled as Miscellaneous Negro Unit. The irony was almost poetic. The battalion that pierced Germany's spine was nearly lost in its paperwork. Patton's personal correspondence paints a mixed portrait. In private letters, he praised the battalion's ferocious effectiveness, but remained dismissive of their political significance. He referred to them as a most useful hammer, but avoided crediting their race publicly. Military brass feared backlash both from Southern politicians and within their own segregated ranks. So while the 761st earned Patton's respect on the battlefield, they remained ghosts in the official war narrative. What shocked Germany, the fury of these so-called second-class soldiers, was sanitized at home. But in the unit's eyes, every destroyed bunker was proof. They belonged here. By the end of their Siegfried campaign, the 761st had suffered staggering losses, both in men and machines. But their push opened a corridor that would be used by more than 20,000 Allied troops. Supply convoys followed their path. Medics set up along their trails. Journalists finally arrived, too late to witness the worst, but eager to retell it with softened edges. Yet one story remained raw and untold, that of the man who destroyed a German bunker by parking his Sherman directly on top and dropping grenades down the hatch. His name was lost. The act was not officially recorded, but among the survivors, he was simply called the man who didn't wait. And perhaps that says more about the 761st than any headline could.
When the casualty reports came in, command headquarters was stunned. The 761st had lost over a third of its men in a single week of combat. Yet they had achieved what other armored divisions couldn't in a month. Maps in Patton's headquarters showed a long, jagged tear in the Siegfried Line, and at its core, the word Black Panthers. But the paperwork didn't tell the full story. In those freezing fields, surrounded by smoke and steel, these soldiers were no longer numbers or statistics. They were symbols of something bigger. Endurance, born from exclusion. The shock in Patton's eyes wasn't about losses. It was about how far sheer willpower had carried them beyond logic, beyond limits, beyond what any of his white subordinates believed possible. Inside mess tents and makeshift foxholes, new rituals emerged. Crews began etching the names of fallen comrades into the inner walls of their Shermans, rough, uneven engravings that would outlast the war itself. Each tank became part machine, part memorial. Some men kept photographs folded inside their helmets. Others marked their gun barrels with initials. They didn't have chaplains or bands to honor the dead, so they built their own remembrance in steel and silence. At night, they shared cigarettes under blackout curtains, whispering jokes between the thuds of distant artillery. It was how they grieved and how they stayed human. For the 761st, the only religion that mattered now was momentum. The German counterattacks came in waves, mechanical and merciless. Panthers and tigers rolled through fog like monsters rising from a grave. Their cannons ripped the air apart. Their tracks ground frozen soil into black dust. But the 761st fought like ghosts, appearing where they shouldn't, hitting from angles no manual covered. Panzerschreck teams that tried to flank them found themselves outmaneuvered by gunners who could predict ambushes before they happened. The battlefield turned into a deadly chessboard. German intelligence reports began describing black tank phantoms operating independently. The term wasn't propaganda, it was fear. Fear of men who didn't stop even when they had every reason to. Racial tension, however, followed them like a shadow. Even as they bled and froze for the same flag, some American supply officers forgot their coordinates. A few MPs refused them entry into liberated towns. In one French village, after the 761st drove out German troops, a local innkeeper welcomed white soldiers but turned the black tankers away. They laughed bitterly and set up camp beside their tanks instead. "We eat with our steel," one gunner said. "It never asks what color we are." That kind of defiance wasn't written into Army code, but it kept them alive. Every insult, every closed door, every denied salute only fueled their engines. As the battalion pushed further east, they began encountering remnants of shattered German formations, deserters, half-frozen conscripts, and bewildered officers. Some surrendered immediately, others fought with suicidal ferocity. In one village, a single Panther tank pinned down an entire company until a 761st Sherman rammed it head-on, locking treads and forcing it off the road. The blast that followed destroyed both tanks, but the path was clear. It became another uncredited victory, one that wouldn't make the papers, but would live forever in the retellings whispered among survivors. They said we couldn't fight. They were right. We didn't fight. We hunted. By late November, Patton himself drove out to inspect the sector. His convoy rolled through muddy roads littered with burnt-out armor and broken helmets. When he reached the 761st's forward command post, he found exhausted, mud-covered men standing beside smoking tanks, still ready to fight. "You're damned good," he said quietly. "Damned good." It was one of the few times he broke character. No cameras, no reporters, just a private acknowledgement from the general to the soldiers he once doubted. The 761st didn't cheer. They simply nodded, climbed back into their machines, and rumbled toward the next line of fire. There was still more Germany to break. No official photograph marked the moment the 761st Tank Battalion finally crossed the last ridge of the Siegfried Line. No general gave a speech, and no band played. There were only exhausted men, drenched in oil and mud, staring at the concrete teeth behind them. That was how history's most important breach passed, quietly under gray skies. The official reports would later call it a limited penetration, a bureaucratic phrase that erased the blood, noise, and sheer will it took to make it happen. But those who were there knew. When the final bunker was silenced, when the smoke cleared, the 761st had done what no one thought they could. They broke the dragon's spine. And in doing so, they proved something larger than any medal could capture. They didn't celebrate. There were no cameras waiting to immortalize their faces. Instead, the men cleaned their guns, shared water from dented canteens, and began digging out the wounded. The silence that followed victory was heavier than the roar of battle. They had survived the unthinkable, and yet the moment felt strangely hollow. Some smiled faintly, others just stared into the distance, as if expecting someone to finally acknowledge them. But none came. A colonel from another division passed by in his jeep, saluted briefly, then drove on. No mention was made of who had opened the path his unit now used. Recognition, like rations, was always late for the 761st. Yet inside the battalion, pride burned brighter than any headline could capture. Someone painted a Black Panther crushing dragon's teeth onto a Sherman's turret. Another crew drew a hammer slamming through a wall with the words, "We don't wait for permission." These makeshift emblems became more than decoration. They were a declaration. Every scar on their tanks told a story, a close call, a fallen friend, a moment of impossible defiance. The Germans may have built the Siegfried Line as an unbreakable barrier, but the 761st had turned it into a memory, a warning to any army that underestimated what desperation and discipline could do when combined. In the following days, the stories of individual heroism spread quietly between units. A driver named Sam Johnson reportedly reversed his tank through a minefield to rescue a trapped platoon. A loader named Cleveland Jones threw burning shells out of his turret by hand when his ammo compartment caught on fire. A gunner named Elbert Williams hit 3 German bunkers with direct shots in under 2 minutes, then climbed out to guide infantry through the wreckage. None of these men would be mentioned in newspapers or receive formal commendations, but their names circulated like passwords, whispered among crews and written on the inside flaps of helmets. Proof that legends didn't need witnesses to exist. The Germans they captured often stared more than they spoke. Some looked away in confusion, others muttered prayers. One Wehrmacht officer, pale and bleeding, reportedly asked, "Who trained you?" The answer came from Sergeant Rivers' surviving gunner, "America, but not the part that talks about us." That exchange became folklore in the battalion. For all the years of being told they weren't fit to fight, they had become the enemy's nightmare. Even captured Germans described them in reports as unpredictable, fast, and fearless. It wasn't meant as praise, but history would remember it that way, because what began as a segregated experiment had turned into a machine the enemy couldn't stop and the army couldn't ignore. By the time Patton's staff updated their situation maps, the breach created by the 761st had become the artery through which entire Allied regiments flowed. Convoys rolled where the Panthers had died. Medics carried stretchers across ground that days before had been impassable. The Siegfried Line had fallen not to overwhelming numbers, but to unrelenting persistence. In Patton's final summary, one line stood out, buried between logistical notes. Negro tank unit performed with uncommon valor. It was bureaucratic, understated, and insufficient. But in the field, no one needed to read it. The proof was written across the mud, the ruins, and the fire-blackened concrete. The 761st didn't just fight through Germany's strongest wall. They shattered every lie built around who they were allowed to be.
The road beyond the Siegfried Line was unlike anything the 761st had encountered. Not because it was more dangerous, but because it was unfamiliar territory. Not just geographically, but spiritually. They had spent years fighting for permission to fight, and now they found themselves leading the way. Forests opened into shattered towns, and every intersection bore the scars of retreating German forces. Yet something about the silence felt more ominous than the gunfire. The deeper they drove into Germany, the fewer cheers they heard. This wasn't France. Civilians didn't throw flowers, they shut their windows. The battalion, so used to being doubted from behind, now realized they were feared ahead.
Their reputation had outpaced their tanks. Letters home became less about battles and more about ghosts. "We're not sure what's waiting for us out here," one corporal wrote, "but I think the war is changing shape." The enemy wasn't just soldiers now. It was what came after. Bombed-out cities with crying children, cattle wandering past corpses, entire villages that surrendered without firing a shot, and others that detonated as soon as American boots crossed the threshold. The 761st had to adapt quickly, shifting from aggression to caution without losing their edge. That balance, to remain deadly but not reckless, became their final lesson. War hadn't just made them warriors, it had made them historians. And the world they rolled into was begging to be rewritten. The turning point came in a small town whose name they never learned. It wasn't on any map, but when they entered, they found an abandoned convoy of German trucks, and in the basements, rows of shackled bodies. Civilians, survivors, something else. The smell hit first, then the silence. It wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. The 761st wasn't trained for what they saw. They weren't medics or liberators or priests. But in that moment, they became all three. They broke locks, carried out emaciated men and women, and offered what little water they had. No orders had prepared them for this, but they moved with purpose, because they knew what it meant to be forgotten. When word reached command, no citation was issued, no formal commendation followed. But a chaplain wrote a report. The black tankers did what no one else had the stomach for. They didn't look away. That line circulated quietly through higher ranks, never printed, but remembered. And in the weeks that followed, the 761st was assigned to more liberated zones. They fought less, but witnessed more. Death camps, execution pits, fields of discarded boots. What began as a military mission had become something else, a collision with the raw, unfiltered truth of the regime they had helped dismantle. And through it all, their tanks rolled forward, not because they were ordered to, but because they had seen what happened when people stopped. By the time the war ended, the 761st had traveled farther, fought longer, and been recognized less than almost any armored unit in the U.S. military. Yet in whispers, their legend grew. Infantrymen told stories of black tanks appearing out of nowhere to save entire squads. French villagers remembered them as the Silent Angels. German prisoners called them the Ghost Steel. Their name didn't make headlines, but it made history. Years later, when archives were opened and medals finally awarded, many of the original crew were gone. But their families came, holding faded photographs and creased letters. Recognition arrived late, but it arrived. The Siegfried Line was never rebuilt. It was left to rot, its dragon's teeth cracked and overgrown. Tourists visited the remains, snapping photos of the concrete blocks and reading plaques that rarely mentioned who had broken through. But in the rusting husks of Sherman tanks recovered from the forests, some found carvings, initials, dates, the word Panther. These were the real monuments, not the statues, not the medals, but the steel that still bore witness. The 761st Tank Battalion didn't just cross into Germany, they crossed into legend. And long after the war faded, they remained etched into the armor of history.